was watching The Phantom Menace recently, and I was noticing a lot more than I usually do. This movie is very exquisitely designed and packed with detail, so I put together a little presentation of everything that stood out to me, as well as a few really obscure facts about the movie that I've learned from various sources over the years. We are going deep here, and I'm really excited to share with you all, so let's get into it. Now, right at the beginning of the movie, there's a really interesting detail that the Radiant 7 here actually is not landing at the droid control ship. That is, the ship with all the antenna dishes where we see the head Nemoidians commanding later in the film. But the opening action of the film occurs instead on just a normal Trade Federation battleship. It's hard to know if this was an intentional choice rather than a mistake, but if so, it might be some very subtle storytelling showing us that the Trade Federation has intentionally arranged for the negotiations to occur on a less conspicuous ship, that they're keeping the droid control ship secret in order to hide their future invasion plans. Then later in the film, the Nemoidian leaders have relocated back to the proper command ship. Speaking of the droid invasion, this landing scene has a number of compelling parallels with the 1984 Japanese animated film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, where a technological military force invades a peaceful kingdom, brutally smashing through any obstacles. Some of these shots and designs are very close matches, which I would be content to call coincidences if it weren't for designer Doug Chang himself confirming that the Trade Federation landing ship was at least partially inspired by one of the airship designs from the Nausicaa film. And while I'm on the topic of these landing ships, there's a neat detail near the end of the film when Anakin flies deep into the hangar bay of the droid control ship. Here we can see that these droid landing ships are actually modular designs. This foot part of the ship is separate from the wing parts of the ship. What we're seeing here is these ships being assembled on board. This is stated in the Star Wars Complete Vehicles book for both the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, where we see these ships disassembled next to Trade Federation core ships as well. The artists apparently really wanted us to know that these landing ships are assembled on board their motherships. Speaking of obscure hangar details, I think it's interesting that we can see Trade Federation cargo containers in the Theed hangar. We first see these big gray boxes as the Jedi discover the invasion plan, and then we see them again here on Naboo. I guess this is meant to represent the Trade Federation moving in equipment during the invasion. It's an interesting detail that the artists did not have to go out of their way to include, but they did. Anyway, let's talk about the ship that normally inhabits this hangar, the Queen's Royal Starship. Something that is particularly interesting about this ship is that it's clearly the fulfillment of one of George Lucas's oldest concepts for the Star Wars films, which is a silver starship, one of the very first things mentioned in the very first draft of the original Star Wars script, incidentally emerging from behind a moon of Utapau. This name wouldn't find its way officially into Star Wars until Revenge of the Sith, but the name would also be considered in early Phantom Menace drafts for what would eventually become Naboo. Interestingly, this sequence with the Queen's Starship features astromech droids rolling out onto the hull of the ship to repair it, which is also a fulfillment of a very early detail written for the original Star Wars in the third draft of the script, where R2 is actually described as coming fully out of his socket and traveling across Luke's X-Wing to repair damage. The Queen's Starship is much less like the contemporary space-age designs of the original trilogy, which were heavily inspired by the rugged detailing on the ships in Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Instead, the Queen's Starship is rooted more in the whimsical, sleek futurism of an older era, but it still retains direct influence from the Space Odyssey film, particularly in the interior, where we can see that the floor patterns are fairly directly lifted from the floor of the pod bay in the Discovery spaceship from that movie, and of course an EVA pod from that movie also appears in Watto's junkyard. Speaking of Tatooine, let's talk about the pod race, which is of course inspired by the chariot race in Ben-Hur, but it's also inspired by car racing, as evidenced by Anakin's pod racer cockpit being inspired by a Maserati birdcage car. Overall, the pod race is a really lavishly detailed sequence, so there's never going to be a shortage of things to point out, but I'll give some attention to an unglamorous but really neat little bit of visual storytelling where we can see a pod racer wreckage right next to the cave that claims Rats Tyrell. It's gone in a flash, but you get a few chances to spot it because it's visible in all 3 laps, and there's a great photo of it in the Creating the Worlds of Star Wars book. Also, is it just me, or does this little floating capsule thing at the pod race also bear a strong resemblance to a flying vehicle in the Nausicaa film? That would not be the first time. After the race, we can see a number of interesting details in Anakin's room, such as these models, which appear to be based on otherwise rejected spaceship designs for this film. So jumping ahead, there's something really neat right as our heroes arrive at Coruscant. Now, it's pretty well known that we get our first glimpse of a Gozanti-class cruiser in this movie here on Tatooine, but another Gozanti also appears over Coruscant, right here. Also, something kind of neat to notice here on Coruscant is that Palpatine has floating furniture in his apartment. These tables and his desk are hovering. Behind the scenes photos reveal that these furniture pieces are held up by blue supports, which they forgot to remove in this shot. Anyway, back to Naboo. This Gungan here is using a device known in lore as a Farsean, something like Gungan electro-binoculars, but they're actually very similar in form to a real-world device known as a stereoscopic rangefinder, which basically does what it sounds like it does. Handheld versions of these from World War II even had the same kind of shoulder bracing that we see on the Gungan version. And of course, one of these also shows up in Nausicaa. I hate to keep harping on it, but this just keeps happening. Now that we're moving into the final battle, there's a really incredible detail, which is that the N1 starfighter actually has what appears to be ailerons, the flight control surfaces responsible for controlling the rolling motion of real-world airplanes. These surfaces actually move as the ship maneuvers. The clearest example is coming up right here, just as ILM visual effects supervisor John Null's cameo character is shot down by turbo laser fire. This fighter in the foreground swerves to avoid the blast, and we can clearly see the ailerons articulate as it does so. Obviously, these surfaces would be seemingly useless in the vacuum of space, but they are no doubt meant for atmospheric maneuvering. It's a really interesting detail, but it's not the only Star Wars starfighter to have this sort of function, because it also shows up on the ARC-170 starfighter in Revenge of the Sith. Well, that's all I have for now. The more I study the Phantom Menace, the more I realize just how much artistry and intention are layered into it. It remains one of the most visually and conceptually ambitious Star Wars films, and I still have a lot of interesting stuff that I didn't include this time, maybe in a future video. I'd like to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.